Welcome back to Disruption Drive, the podcast to deconstruct the strategies and technologies reshaping how the world moves. I'm your host, Harvey Sripathy. The traditional history of innovation follows a predictable script. New, transformative technology almost always starts as a luxury. First, a high-priced toy for early adopters, eventually, of course, getting adopted as aspirational consumers surge. Beep flips that script. My guests today take the space age technology of autonomous vehicles and put it to work right now where it's needed the most. Transit agencies, universities, and our public squares. They solve the clunky problems of old world congestion, labor shortages, and increasing access to transport by making the public high-tech transit a public utility rather than a private privilege. I'm joined today by Toby McGraw, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Beep, and also happens to be one of the foremost experts on transportation and transit systems. Toby, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I want to put you on the spot almost immediately and ask the sort of elephant in the room question on economic benefits. And you have a unique take on it because your economic benefits go beyond unit bus economics or unit vehicle economics, which is what everyone else is solving for. You have a societal benefit. You reduce congestion. You solve skill shortages. You create skills. But how do you break that down, dimensionalize it to your buyers who are, and by the way, I've not even mentioned the climate sustainability goals that you help them meet. But how do you break that down to your buyers who are often, transit agencies and sometimes universities, uh, and of course, people like resorts?
Absolutely. So really our focus is on the total mobility ecosystem. So we're thinking about how we can solve problems, not just around congestion, but also competition at the curb. We're thinking about how we can allow better access for workforce. We think about ADA inclusion, as well as economic development along these AV corridors. When we talk about labor, a lot of times, we're really thinking about the reallocation of labor and not labor reduction. And so when you think about agencies that are currently, struggling with scarce CDL drivers, how can we take the drivers that they have, make sure that they're focused on the higher demand routes, and we're able to then implement additional services instead of having to cut routes or cut services. So long term, you do see this value around the cost per passenger mile dropping over time, as utilization continues to grow. And really that's accomplished by trying to get rid of these single occupancy trips. So as great as the technology is with robotaxi, and it's absolutely fantastic. I use Waymo every chance I get. That it's making it more affordable, cheaper, easier to have a single passenger ride. So when we think about those benefits beyond, and especially when we're thinking about congestion, it's hard to accomplish that. And it's also, Waymo is just from an affordability perspective, something that not everyone can afford. And so when we think about, this idea of access, it's beyond just ADA and physical accessibility. It's people, really that can't always afford to use something other than public transit. So how can we actually enable that population through shared autonomy, and then get additional riders on the transit ecosystem?
And so, summarizing that, you're definitely trying to increase overall transportation access and affordability, of course. And we'll get to that in a second. But I do want to ask you, start with the technology of it itself, because you're a fixed route provider in terms of buses, which is, at least on that dimension, technologically less complex than a variable route in robotaxi, since your routes and stops are fairly fixed. But on the other end, your integration, the ecosystem in which you work in, it tends to be, I'm assuming, fairly clunky. Many times governments, universities, and academic, and also slow moving. So I did want to ask you, you have space age tech. How do you work with clunky technology on your client side?
Yeah, that's a great question, and of course, selling into the public space, it's not always there's not the ability to move as quickly as you can in the consumer space, and so Beep is really trying to act as that integration layer where we're bridging, multiple OEMs, so multiple manufacturers, various AV stacks. We're trying to incorporate it into the legacy systems that exist within fleets today. And so when you think about legacy systems like the Trapezes or even the AVL companies like Samsara and others, really trying to make sure that we're fitting within those existing systems. When we think about governance structures, we're trying to ensure whether it's procurement compliance, FTA frameworks, engagement with represented labor. We're not trying to bypass the system. We're really trying to take those conversations and have them first up to ensure that we can really bring a better value to system. And then ultimately, the way that we've thought about this is crawling before we walk. And so really trying to focus on those operationally simple use cases first. And so when you think about some of the fixed routes, defined stops, geo-fenced areas, we're really trying to focus on those so we can ensure that we're operating at an excellent level. We're gaining public trust, and then you continue to grow as the technology grows and expand to other areas.
And so that's an interesting point, but tell me a bit about, you mentioned fitting within existing structures and not trying to bypass systems. So tell me a little bit about how you actually work within so how are you crawling before you actually end up running as well? So tell me a little bit about how you work with those systems.
Yeah, a great example of that is a project that we've done in Jacksonville, Florida. So, Jacksonville Transportation Authority (JTA) has been one of the leaders in testing and deploying shared autonomous vehicles over the last 5 or 6 years. And so, very early on in the journey, it was testing low speed shuttles. And so, when you think about some of the original vehicles developed by Navia, by Local Motors, really fixed route, 10 to 15 mile an hour speed, 8 to 12 passenger vehicles on very simple fixed route areas. And the very early on, it was how do we engage the community? How do we educate, stakeholders like first responders? So if medical or fire are coming to an event and they have a vehicle, they know how to interact with it. You always, hope for the best, plan for the worst. And so you really have to engage, the communities to do that. And so there's this kind of long testing history of first, we're going to do it on test track, then we're going to do it on a simple public road. And then you continue to add complexity. Looks like I'm lagging just a little bit. Did it catch back up?
I think we're back now, but
Okay.
I did want to ask you, look, Beep's had a journey as well. You've been a vertically integrated uh, transportation provider, and now, of course, you work very much on that sort of integration layer, if you may. Is your goal to be that horizontally integrated, or public transportation, I'll call it sharing ecosystem, potentially including micromobility, shuttle services, access a ride, or so on? Or do you really want to own the bus space, which I know you have done as well?
Yeah, so I think ultimately we are focused on how we can meet our customers where they need us to be. So Beep has a strategy where we are agnostic to the form factor itself. So we work with a handful of different vehicle OEMs. We started from kind of like this shuttle form factor, 10 to 20 passengers. We do have some options that are coming that are going to be smaller when you think about 4 to 5 passenger as well. And so incorporating this into microtransit type of systems makes a ton of sense. We have partnered with various microtransit providers historically on several projects already. And so we really do believe that there's that opportunity to support the full stack. We envision a world where our customers will be running multiple different vehicles, multiple different form factors. They need a single platform to be able to run all those plans, to plan routes, to plan schedules, to plan charging and headways. And Beep's platform is really the one to be able to do that.
Absolutely. And let me go back to some of the questions you just some of the sort of seeds you laid there, which was around affordability and increased accessibility as well. And now it's great to talk about, of course, but on the back end, that requires an enormous amount of operational efficiency, particularly in the world which you play in, which includes, if effectively every vehicle you use is shared among a variety of customers, end users. And how do you build that system to be that operationally efficient? And particularly want to point out you're working across an ecosystem with just a wide, probably the most widest variety ecosystem there is. You're working with fleet managers, cleaners, remote drivers, chargers, and the maintenance folks, and identifying edge cases in the software, really everything. And you need to maximize the uptime of the vehicle because you actually are a public utility goods. So uptime maximization sort of is the game. How do you do that?
That's right. And for us, I think that I would speak to that across three different dimensions. First and foremost, really when we think about it, we're really focused on fleet level efficiency, not just vehicle level. So it's actually a step up from even thinking about the vehicle itself. So we think about things like centralized remote command center. We think about predictive maintenance, and we think about smart charging orchestration, just to ensure that across various vehicles, we're able, because uptime is not just the vehicles available for service. The vehicle has to be charged. It has to be properly inspected. Anything that was, out of repair needs to be repaired. So it's all the vehicle maintenance thing, as well as charging, as well as what parts of the route are open, what are desired headways, and so it's that systems level integration that we're really thinking about. The next piece of it is just thinking about how we're starting to standardize playbooks across multiple deployments. And when you think about the sheer number of edge cases, it's building these libraries around edge cases. As we learn more and as the system gets smarter, it's providing over-the-air updates to the vehicle and really getting to a place where there's a repeatable training framework that allows us to continue to scale, grow out, and then use an approach that we can take this to different markets and different customers to be able to learn from best practices and drive forward.
Absolutely. And I want to sharpen the pencil a bit on a point you made is that one of the things you mentioned is that you have a very broad-based stakeholder involvement, example unions, but you often you're not just educate you're of course at the end of the day what wins the game is end user adoption, and you often have to work through these channels to get there. So you're often in a game where you're educating the educator themselves to build this ecosystem. But this is still at the end of the day a nascent bet. Autonomous vehicles are less than 1% of the cars on the road today.
Sure.
How do you make such a bet? And and at the same time, a lot of this technology is proprietary to you, and you cannot share too much. Some of it, of course, still needs to be built. So where do you draw that line of control, if I may ask you?
Yeah, and so ultimately we have to think about how we co-develop with our agency partners. We're not trying to sell to them. And so as much as we want to create repeatable motions, there's going to be, a certain segment, maybe 80%, that's repeatable site to site, that's going to be very standard. But you have to be able to kind of customize that last. And now is it 10% or 20%? There's still things that we're learning about that in terms of scale. But there are elements of this where you really have, kind of the standard best practice, but it needs to be really tightened for a specific deployment. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing that we think through is just making sure that we're educating very early. And so when we think about our stakeholders in market, it's not just the transit authority. It could be the local DOT, the state DOT. There could be various other, MPOs and other funding partners that we're getting involved very early on as well. It's of course engagement with represented labor. So when we think about, the future development of these systems, there becomes this great workforce development opportunity when we think about, the LiDAR radar kits themselves, when we think about electric drivetrain, the batteries, remote command and control environment. So there's this new ecosystem of potential jobs that we have to make sure that we're talking about and planning for and working with, higher education sometimes to develop curriculum. So those are all the things that we're really focused on. And then within our agency engagements, we have to just be very clear on who owns what piece of the puzzle. So, when we think about things like safety, the autonomy operations, systems integrations, things that are really near and dear to the safe transition of these vehicles and the safe movement of these vehicles. Those are things that are non-negotiable that really BEEP has to be a part of. And then we think about other things like, how we're collecting fares, how we're enforcing various rules around fare collection. When we think about community engagement, there becomes opportunities to partner and in some case hand off to our partner to run those singularly. And so the idea is to make sure we're very clear of who owns what so that we don't have friction or overlap or even worse when we don't have coverage on an important topic.
Absolutely, it's very well said. So clearly looks like it's a bit of there's a little bit of a dance going on here because different ecosystems may simply work differently, and you work sort
Of
of
course.
in practically a consultative environment with, of course, your product itself. I wanna ask you a little bit about, look, there's a bunch of things you said. There's of course a 10%, 20% customization involved here, right? But how do you figure out and this is very, very new technology, let's be fair here. When do you figure out that you can actually hand off, you know, ownership of this to someone else when, look, that the risk is, well, they may just not be ready yet.
Right. And so this is something where, having been within technology startups in transportation for the last 20 years, something that's been a key throughout time, this idea of you can't manage what you can't measure. And so making sure that we set clear metrics around the things that are going to make us successful. And so when we think about, what's our autonomy rate, what's our average uptime, what's headway, what's our on-time performance, like all those different things are incredibly important. We have a bunch of hypotheses in market around, we believe that autonomy can definitely lower our cost per service hour. And allow for higher frequency in some of these underserved corridors. That's getting proven out kind of market by market, but that's something that we have to be very clear about understanding what our SLAs, what our service level obligations are, as well as what some of these metrics to make sure that actually work. We believe, to start, that fixed route AVs work best in transit deserts. When we think about campus connectors, medical districts, or other kind of workforce housing corridors. Those are all areas that we think make a ton of sense. And we really want to prioritize the deployments where the service is currently like current service or current transportation is constrained, whether that's by cost, by budget, by hours availability, or just where the lines are physically running through a city, where there might be a new development, new locations that don't yet have operations.
Let me push you on one of the points you made, and I don't disagree with it, but I do want to push you on it because you mentioned your best benefit maybe in transit deserts, which happen to be low frequency, often. But your fundamental best bet is to share rides, and I've felt that, well, why not focus on very dense environments instead? Of course, there's so just asking you almost a devil's advocate question. If
Totally.
your goal is, yeah, go ahead.
And for us, because the focus is really on the shuttle form factor, when we think 10 to 20 passengers, those aren't going to be the best option necessarily for the highest frequency routes. And so if we think about a large, fully utilized, articulated bus, when we think about driven cost per hour, that's something that's going to be a highly efficient form factor for quite a while. But does that same bus need to run at midnight or 12 to 4, these hours where there's just less people? And so that's where you could think about this kind of having an ecosystem that shares some of that ride. You could also think about, when we talk about transit, and there's been a ton of interest from, USDOT and others kind of thinking about the rural opportunities as well, where there's just not service today or it's just not cost effective to do that.
Got
So
it.
that's where you can start to think about this solution where, on one side of it, you have a fixed route bus, which when fully utilized can be a very high efficiency when we think about cost per passenger mile or hour. But it's also highly inflexible, right? So if you miss the bus, you're waiting for the next one. On the other side of the equation has been the TNCs, the Uber, the Lyfts, the robo taxis, where your cost per passenger mile or hour is probably going to be your highest, but your flexibility is also the highest.
Right.
So we really think about this world as maybe somewhere in the middle. So could we think about having flex route or demand response options where we're building routes around where we know there's going to be demand at any given time, or maybe there's even a pre-booked and pre-planned demand that we can plug into the system so that we can bring more flexibility to the system than a traditional fixed route line, but way more cost efficiency than a TNC or robotaxi in terms of cost per passenger mile.
Well, let me zoom out a little bit and maybe ask you a question, which I know we started off there, but you're definitely turning the script of innovation, starting off as a luxury. Typically, you're instead bringing it to the masses. But your focus is not just bringing it, making it more affordable, but also distributing that benefit to, it's so how do you ensure that you not just serve the most people, but also the people who serve that the most? You mentioned transit does it and so on. Maybe that's the answer already, but I just wanted to let you off on that, which is how do you ensure that it's not just the most people, but the people who need it the most, who get the benefits of Beep?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we really partner very closely with our agency and community partners, to really ensure that we are serving those most in need. And so whether it's specific accessibility needs, whether specific location value needs, we really have to partner with our city stakeholders to understand that. So when we're launching in a new market, even when we're launching with the transit itself, we're having conversations with the downtown business corridor. We're having conversations with accessibility groups. We're having conversations with others at county, sometimes at the city level, mayor's office, city council, really to make sure that we're hearing and learning needs. As we start to go into market, some of the things that we did at Jacksonville very early on in our testing phases is we did a bunch of community engagement events where we had the vehicle set up at various events where people were coming to and asking questions and soliciting feedback and really trying to learn, where would you leverage these vehicles if they were an option? And so you really try to use that both at kind of the grassroots level among individual users and passengers, all the way up through the agencies that are responsible for that movement. And so that to us is the key, because every market's going to have its own kind of flavor of this, and every market can deploy these in slightly unique ways. We believe there's this foundational mission that these vehicles can expand mobility access, and so it's more about expanding access, driving riders into the broader ecosystem, more than just deploying cool tech. I think that there was a very early on within this industry where I was like, hey, let's try something cool. Let's get a grant to try something cool. We're starting to move beyond that, where it's like, okay, we've done this testing, we've showcased it, we've done field trips to these locations. Now, how can we actually deploy this technology in a way that will expand access?
Absolutely. Well, talking of foundational missions, if there's one takeaway from today, it is that the space age on the road doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the maintenance bays, the charging stations, and most of all, the local communities where accessibility matters the most. And Beep is building that ecosystem to push forward transportation and autonomous vehicles as well to the people who need it the most. Toby, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks a lot, Harry. All right, great.